Today we're going to be in Chapter 9, going through Sections 1 and 2, and maybe introduce just a little bit of Section 1 of or Section 3 of Chapter 9 of our muscular system. Here's a little comic for you regarding maybe some of our abilities to dissect cats here. We're going to need some parts here that hopefully don't dissect out, but we're going to hopefully improve in those skills. First, just a little introduction about, nerves, muscles and bones. This one happens to be about nerves. This is Chelsea Thomas, who had Mobius syndrome, which uh, infects the sixth and seventh cranial nerves that come out of our brain and actually innervate our muscle tissue in our face. And so early on in Chelsea's life, she had difficulties doing a number of things, including facial expressions and swallowing and um, so on. And so she went through a number of tests, and in 1995, when she was about 7 years old, she had what we call smiling surgery to repair those nerves as they innervate the muscles of our face and tongue, and to allow her to do some things. And so we know that communication is a big piece of comes from our facial expressions. And so now Chelsea kind of has this permagrin, if you will, but we take those things for granted, of being able to move the muscles in our face and being able to eat and swallow and push our food back with our tongue. And so she's doing well now, and but that surgery certainly had an impact on her life. Um, a number of things that muscles do that we'll talk about first, before we get to all the three types. All our body movements require muscles, and our muscles are organized into various cells, and we use ATP to exert some sort of pulling force. And our muscles provide us with tone and propel bodily fluids and generate a heartbeat and distribute heat. And so those are the things that all these three muscle types do. First, we have skeletal muscle that attaches to bones. It's voluntary, or meaning somatic, so we control it. That's what somatic means, is voluntary. And they also have striations, and that's how we recognize them under the microscope. And we'll talk about those striations later. Next, we have smooth muscle that we find in our digestive system, blood vessels, even attached to our hair follicle with the erector pili muscle. It's involuntary, so we don't control it, and our word for that's autonomic. And smooth muscle is non-striated. And then, of course, we have cardiac muscle that we only find in the heart. It's involuntary, or again, autonomic. It is striated, and we have intercalated discs. And we studied those three muscles back in Chapter 5 as we looked at the muscle tissue. Our four major characteristics and five major functions. First, the idea of excitability means that we can have some sort of electrical stimulus that causes our muscle to do something. Contracting means that the muscle is going to shorten, and then extensibility means our muscle is going to lengthen in nature. And then the elasticity means that our muscles have an ability to stretch. Our five major functions, we produce some sort of movement. Maybe that's skeletal muscle moving our bones so we can run, jump, hop, skip, or maybe it's the movement of our heart when it contracts, causing the movement of our blood flowing through the parts of our body, and then even our digestive system, moving our food along so we can absorb the nutrients and then eventually defecate it out or urinate it out. Muscle helps maintain our posture and our body position when we're standing, sitting, running, jumping, all those things. One of the coolest things of body position would be a gymnast who has amazing control over the body. Supports our soft tissues, so gives them some shape and holds them in place. Guards the entrances to our body of our eyes, mouth, nose, and ears, and also the parts of our body where we exit, the sphincter muscles, where things move on and out of our body. And then one of the biggest things that we generate for our body is heat, and our muscles generate that body heat for us. So, organization of our skeletal muscle. All of our muscles contain its muscle tissue, and we're going to focus mainly on skeletal muscle tissue. So we got to be innervated, so we have nerve tissue. We have blood, which is a type of connective tissue, and then we have other types of connective tissue from fascia, which is a thick a connective tissue on the most outside of our skeletal muscles, and that fascia typically turns into a tendon or an aponeurosis. Tendons connect our muscles to bones, as you can kind of see here, and our aponeuroses are thin sheets of connective tissue that connects muscle to muscle in various places in our body. So first we'll talk about the connective tissues. There's three types: epi, peri, and endo. Endo is the connective tissue that's the most inside. Perimysium is sort of between, as we'll see here, and then the epimysium sits upon or is on the most outside. And then we'll talk about uh, um, again the going into our fascia, the fourth kind of covering going into a tendon and or aponeuroses. So our connective tissue coverings, the first one, that endomysium, we find it's just a delicate layer that's wrapped around a cell fiber. So here you can see a cell fiber. Sometimes a cell fiber is just simply referred to as a muscle cell. So when we're using the word muscle fiber, we're just meaning a single muscle cell. And so as you can see, kind of wrapped around that muscle fiber, we have endomysium that's wrapped around it. You can see that layer right here. Next, we take a bunch of muscle fibers and put them together, and we get what we call a fascicle. A fascicle is just several muscle fibers. So you can see one there, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and here's the ninth one. And so we take all those muscle fibers or cells and group them into this larger structure called a fascicle. And that fascicle is surrounded by connective tissue, which we call perimysium. And so all the way around this, we have that connective tissue perimysium. So one fascicle can be connected to another fascicle. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 fascicles, well, 8 if we're counting that one, fascicles that bundle together. Those fascicles bundle together to form a skeletal muscle, and surrounding our skeletal muscle, we have another connective tissue that goes all the way around our skeletal muscle, maybe our bicep brachii muscle, that's covered by that connective tissue, and that's called the epimysium. It sits upon the muscle. And so all of those things together make up, and so we sort of get a fourth layer called fascia, and that kind of fascia covers our muscle and makes its way into something called a tendon or possibly an aponeurosis, and that's going to attach muscle to bone, muscle to cartilage, or maybe muscle to other muscle. One thing really didn't talk about too much on this one, this page, is the myofibrils yet. Myofibrils, as I move some things around here, are the thin bands that make up our muscle fiber. And so we have a bunch of myofibrils together. You can see several of them here making up our muscle fiber. Those myofibrils in turn are made of two even smaller strands or bands, sometimes called myofilaments. Myofilaments, myo meaning muscle, filament meaning just a thin strand. One is thick and one is thin. Um, we have actin and myosin. Myosin is the really thick protein, and we're going to talk about that. And then actin is the real thin protein, and they're going to interact with each other. We also have titin involved, which is an elastic myofilament that helps create the structure of our muscle, and that'll make a little more sense as I talked about it on a future slide. So if we break down actin and myosin, you can see down here, makes up a myofibril. Myofibrils make up muscle fibers. Muscle fibers make up fascicles. Fascicles help make up our skeletal muscle. So that's sort of the organization that we'll see, and we're going to talk about that and look at put together our Arnold Schwarzenegger muscle project, and hopefully you'll understand this a little bit better after doing the project itself. So you can see here, this diagram, we can see some actual muscle tissue. Here we can see individual muscle fibers. So there would be, myofibril. We take those and put a whole bunch of myofibrils, put them together into a muscle um, fiber, and then our different muscle fibers here make up, as you can see there, our fascicle, that whole thing right there. So that's what it sort of looks like from a tissue standpoint. So if we're going to take a little closer, just a single muscle cell or muscle fiber, there's several parts to a muscle fiber, and one of the things that we looked at in chapter 5 was um, striations. And so we have bands that were dark. Here you can see a little bit darker area, and here, and then next to it you can see a little bit lighter area. So dark, light. And so we kind of get a repeating pattern, and that's kind of where our striations come from. And so a muscle fiber is just a really long, thin muscle cell. Sometimes some muscle fibers are longer than others depending on their location of the body. And so we're going to go through and talk about the different aspects of this and talk about some I bands and H bands and the myofibrils and again the actin and myosin type structures and try to define some things for us here. So again, here we have a muscle fiber, a single cell, and muscle fibers are made up of myofibrils. Okay, so here's one myofibril, there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We got 11 myofibrils that make up this particular muscle fiber. Each one of those myofibrils is made up of myofilaments. And we have the two myofilaments, actin and myosin. Remember, the myosin myofilaments are thick and the actin myofilaments are thin. And so it's a little bit easier to make the difference of those on the other slides, but on this slide the myofilaments that are myosin are the purple, and then the thin ones are going to be a little bit bluer, and we'll actually see that on a different slide a little bit better. But these are going to be the two filaments that interact and actually cause a muscle contraction, as we'll see in a little bit. So those are the thick filaments, myosin, and the thin filaments, actin. Next, we have on here a couple things that we need to just talk about. The muscle cell membrane is called the sarcolemma. And so we give that a special name of sarcolemma. Prefix sarco means muscle. And so this is going to come into play later when we're actually talking about a muscle contraction, and that gets generated or started here at the cell membrane or the sarcolemma. With the sarcoplasm, that's just the cytoplasm of the cell with all the organelles and cytosol that's inside that muscle fiber. With the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that's just a fancy way of saying the endoplasmic reticulum for the muscle cell. And you can see the sarcoplasmic, it's sort of a network of tubes here. Kind of looks like, oh, I don't know, a spider web type situation. We have a T-tube or a transverse tubule, a little opening. It's just really an extension of the sarcolemma that goes deep into the muscle fiber. So as we have an electrical signal that travels down our sarcolemma, that electrical signal can travel deep inside the muscle fiber through these transverse tubules. So really the transverse tubules are tubes that are really made up of our sarcolemma. To go along with that, next to those transverse tubules, we have these big sort of holding tanks, if you will, that kind of are connected or part of our sarcoplasmic reticulum. They look like bigger tubes. Maybe I should do this in a different color. There's one tube there and one tube there, and they're called cisternae. They're part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but they're big holding tanks. A cistern is just a holding tank. Typically, cisterns we see on a farm, they hold water, or Quick Trip has cisterns that hold gasoline underneath the ground, and so they're just big holding tanks. And these big holding tanks are part of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So together, the two cistern, along with the transverse tubule, make up what we call a triad. So 1, 2, 3, 1 tube, 2 tube, 3 tube, when we call that a triad. So that T tube along with those two cisterns make up what we call a triad, and they're going to be really important in terms of having a muscle contraction and sustaining a muscle contraction. I think we'll stop there for today. That's a good part when we'll talk about the having a muscle contraction and taking a look at our myofibril in our next segment.